What's going on, man? Welcome back to the basement. I'm Ron. Today we have something a little bit different. We talked through our waiver wire must-adds yesterday, which means waivers have rolled through this morning, and now you have free reign over free agency in your league. You can pick and choose whoever you want to add to your team. And that's so important because we were also talking about yesterday. It is time to dial up, get locked in here. We have this week, we have next week, and then we have the fantasy playoffs. And with trade deadlines passed in everybody's leagues, the only way to really improve your team for your playoff run is to make moves now. So this is going to be a video where we go through a bunch of players, literally a top 20 handcuff tier list. We have some quarterback streams for the playoffs, some quarterback stashes for the playoffs, some defenses. We got everything. We have a lot to get into today, but I'm going to get you guys right for these fantasy playoffs, especially on a Wednesday where all of these waivers have gone through, and you can now just sort of watch this video and snipe players here and there as you see fit. So with that being said, we're not going to waste any time. If you enjoyed the video at any point, make sure to go down below, subscribe, leave a like. Let's go.
Thirsty, trying to choose. I know I'm pretty cool. My nitty bag.
Now, first up, we're going to talk through my top 20 handcuff running back ranking. So this is pretty much entirely based on contingency. So if the starter goes down, how much does that running back get elevated? Now, I want to say what you should be doing here is you should be looking at this list and pretty much picking out players on your roster that you see as droppable. I think right now the perfect players to drop are like roster clogging wide receivers like Devontae Parkers, Nico Collins, Terrace Marshalls, Marquez Valdez-Scantling I think is in there. Any wide receiver on your bench right now that you can't see actually starting in your lineup in the playoffs and coming out with a win, those players should not be on your team at this point. Those should be casted off to the side, and you should exchange those for lottery picks off of waiver wire. Because let's say a guy like Devontae Parker, Jacoby Myers goes down. I don't know. What does Devontae Parker go from like a wide receiver 6 to a wide receiver 5? Same thing with Nico Collins if Brandon Cooks doesn't play. But you have a guy like Alexander Madison, where if Dalvin Cook goes down, you now have an RB1 off the bench, which is a massive, massive advantage, especially in the playoffs. If you can have that 1 week leverage, maybe the guy you're playing against has Dalvin Cook, boom, you are in a very good spot there. So we're going to talk through each and every single handcuff I deemed, reasonable to talk about. We're bringing back the tier list, a little bit different this time, where I have RB1s if the starter goes down. So this is obviously handcuffs, or if the starter goes down, they would be a top 12 running back for me, either rest of season or just that week in fantasy, right? I'm going through my weekly rankings, and boom, I would have them in my top 12. RB2s, top 24 running backs. Fringe RB2s are probably like running backs in that 24 to 30 area. And then RB3s would be guys, around RB35 that maybe you could get away with starting them in like hero RB team. So we have at the top here, also another caveat is for all of these players, they are 75% or less owned on ESPN. The idea here is usually I do 50%, but I don't want it to be too exclusive. I want you guys out there that are like in 8-10-man leagues, maybe one flex league, short bench leagues, to just sort of see where my head's at when it comes to these handcuffs, when it comes to these quarterbacks and defenses down the line. Now, when we talk about RB1 overall in our handcuff rankings, it's Rachaad White, who's shockingly only owned in 67.5% of ESPN leagues. And we saw what a Leonard Fournette-less world looks like for Rachaad White last week. Now, I also want to preface, I limited myself to one bullet point per each player because you guys know me. I'll just fill each thing up with a bunch of stats, and we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty once we get down to the RB3s, and I wanted to get this video out to you guys quick so you guys could see it on Wednesday. Now, last week, with no Leonard Fournette, Rachaad White had 90% of the snaps, which is amazing, 9 targets, again amazing, 23 touches, over 100 total yards. He had 19.9 PPR points as the RB9. And I like him at number 1 here because Fournette is hurt right now. He missed last week. He has upside to miss next week. And then you also have the upside with Rachaad White that he's not only a contingent play, but before Leonard Fournette went down, he was like the starting running back in quotes, like almost even 50-50 split. He could just outright win that job from Fournette. So he has a ton of outs to, win on that bet. We've already seen him look good with a workhorse role. No brainer for me at the 101. Now we only have only one other running back that I would put in the RB1 conversation. Again, these are guys that I would rank firmly in my top 12. No doubt about it if the starter went down, and this would be A.J. Dillon. And look, I get it. The Packers offense has been pretty bad this year. They're 10th lowest in scoring, but if Aaron Jones was to go down, to me, it just wouldn't really matter. Whether the offense is good or bad, if Jordan Love was in there, we would see A.J. Dillon completely unleashed in a workhorse role, and that would be huge. We saw last season, he had one game without Aaron Jones. He had a game where Aaron Jones was limited. In both of those, A.J. Dillon saw 5 or more targets, which is huge for a ceiling of a guy who is so big, so efficient on the ground, is going to punch in goal line looks as well. If you can add onto all of that receiving upside, you're in for pretty much an RB1. And if we look at his 4 career games that he has, I didn't want to use that 2-game sample. It was with Aaron Jones, and he had one game where Aaron Jones wasn't, he was hurt, played a couple snaps. But we have a 4-game sample of him earning that type of volume, and he's at 16.25 points per game, which would be the RB9 this year, aka an RB1. So A.J. Dillon is there for me, even though this has been a really tough year for him. If you draft him in fantasy, you hate to own him. But the good news is that he's available in he'd be available in 35% of leagues. Someone that a lot of people are dropping. I think in more casual leagues, he's probably hanging out on waivers. But if I saw A.J. Dillon, he's pretty much one of the guys that needs to be on your bench if you're just having lottery tickets fly on that side of your roster. Now, our next tier is RB2s. If the starter was to go down, they would, to me, be firmly inside the top 24, no doubt about it. And first up, we have Samaje Perine. And I like Samaje Perine for the fact that we've now seen Samaje Perine in back-to-back weeks where Joe Mixon was banged up 2 weeks ago, and then he's out last week. So we saw 2 weeks of Samaje Perine in a prominent role. He's the RB2 overall in scoring the last 2 weeks behind just Josh Jacobs. He is, if Joe Mixon goes down, he is the lead guy on a top 5 scoring offense. You still have the upside of Joe Mixon missing another week here. And the beautiful part about this is it's not only a great situation, but he is in a spot where they only want to get Perine involved. He saw 24 of 27 running back opportunities last week, which means he just has a complete monopoly of this backfield when the starter goes down. I think something else we're looking for with these handcuff rankings is if the starter goes down and it just becomes a committee between the 2 backups or the 3 backups, that's not really a handcuff we want to roster. We want a guy where the starter goes down and you can immediately put that player into your roster, at least for the high-end tiers, like where we have Perine. Now, RB4 here is going to be Alexander Mattison. And I'll explain why he's not higher in a second. By the way, his rostership on ESPN is absolutely egregious. 23.2% owned on ESPN, which means that in 75% of ESPN leagues, he is just hanging out on the waiver wire. And this is a backup to Dalvin Cook, who has notoriously had shoulder issues, ACL issues. He is yet to finish an entire season without missing a game. We are in year 6 here. He has not missed a game. I think that he's a pretty decent bet out of any running back out there to eventually miss a game here. And Alexander Mattison has 6 games without Dalvin Cook. In all of them, he averages 20-plus points per game, and he averages 20-plus touches per game, which is pretty crazy, especially in the modern NFL where maybe only 3, 4, 5 running backs actually see that kind of usage just as starters. Now, the reason that I don't have him in that RB1 tier, like I probably would have had him last year, is we have a coaching change. So he's been favored by, when Zimmer was there, when the Kubiaks were there as OCs. We don't know how O'Connell feels about Alexander Mattison. He's obviously the clear 2, but there's a chance that he would work in Keenan Wangwu, who has gotten run before. Maybe they don't even feature him as the focal point of the offense if Dalvin Cook gets hurt. They would just probably lean on Jefferson, Thielen, whatever. So there's some uncertainty there, which is why I have Alexander Mattison a little bit lower than you'd expect. But again, I think RB4 is still pretty dang high. Now, at RB5, we have Damian Harris here. And this is a really cool chart from Hayden Winks that kind of breaks down why I like Damian Harris. And this is the RB usage by team chart that he posted, I believe, last week. And what it breaks down is usage by team. So based on carries, targets, expected points to the running back position, what team is supplying the most fantasy points to the position, not just the starter, but to the position as a whole. And the Patriots are up there with a team like San Francisco. We talked about this before the season with Ramondre and Damian Harris. There is a lot of running back points to go around in New England. They like to run the ball there. And if Ramondre was to go down, all of that usage would be going to Damian Harris. Now, of course, maybe they bring in Pierre Strong. Maybe they bring in I think Kevin Harris is actually still out there. Maybe they bring in a J.J. Taylor type, but Damian Harris would get the keys to a backfield that is supplied with a ton of points, and he would have, 70% plus of that entire share and pretty easily be a weekly, like, top 18 running back for me in the weekly rankings. Now, after that, we have Jaylen Warren, who got a little bit of a bump down. I was actually going to put him as the first ranked player in this tier before we got some news on Najee Harris, because the idea was not that Najee Harris going down means that Jaylen Warren would be an absolute monster. It was that Najee Harris was dealing with an injury. There was upside for him to miss the entire season with this abdominal thing, which means Jaylen Warren, who is hurt right now, but the minute that he returns would be the workhorse running back for the Steelers for like the last 4 or 5 weeks, which is a really, really valuable role. This came out today from Rappaport. Najee Harris was ruled out of Monday night's game with an abdominal injury, did not suffer major injury, sources say. His status this week are up in the air, and he'll be reevaluated as the practice week goes on, but no significant injury. So that means that the timeline of like 3, 4, 5 weeks, possibly surgery, season ending with like a hernia or something, I believe that's no longer on the table. It seems like he's going to be week to week now, which means that the immediate upside for Jaylen Warren is no longer there, but I still really like Jaylen Warren as a handcuff. We have the Steelers offense in general, who features running backs. We've seen D'Angelo Williams, the year that Le'Veon Bell was like facing a suspension, was like a top 12 running back. During that stretch, we saw with James Conner when Le'Veon Bell set out. We haven't really seen since then a clear case study of, Mike Tomlin just feeding the beast when it comes to a running back, but they love Jaylen Warren. They went from last year where Najee Harris had all of the targets, all of the workload, all of the carries, to actually making it a point to give Jaylen Warren some of that volume. If Najee was to go down, I think Jaylen Warren would be like an 80% plus opportunity share type guy, which even in a bad offense like the Steelers is still valuable and would still be pretty easily a top 24 back for me on a weekly basis. Now, after that, we move down a tier. We go to the Fringe RB2s area, which are guys where the starter goes down. They have upside to eventually be RB2s every week, but that first week the starter goes down, I'd probably have them around RB30 area, which are still guys you can plug and play in hero RB and zero RB lineups like a lot of us have out there, but they're not guys that I am all that confident with. And first we have J.K. Dobbins, our 7th ranked handcuff running back here. He's available in 45% of ESPN leagues right now. And this one's a weird one because, there is no Dalvin Cook in this backfield. There is no lead guy. You have Gus Edwards. You have Kenyon Drake. I guess you could say Gus Edwards is like the established lead back right now, but he's had only like 3 games healthy this year. But what this comes down to is if J.K. Dobbins can get healthy and can get back to that lead back role, he has a ton of upside. I'm just being conservative here. I think that if he was healthy and he was like coming back from injury, he'd obviously be in the RB2 area, but I'm going to be conservative here. We saw him last time we saw him on the field. He was struggling with an ACL injury. Not that it was, I guess it actually ended up, sidelining him or whatever, but he just didn't have the same juice, the same explosiveness as a player. Hopefully that's kind of worn off. And then it's also kind of baked in here is maybe he's still not the same guy. And if he's not the same guy, then it's pretty much over until next season. But maybe he is the same guy, or not the same guy, but, 85% of what he once was. And you put him in a spot here where if he's simply the lead back, he benefits from the efficiency of Lamar Jackson, who is running all over the place, read options, or doing stuff out of the pistol with motion. There's a ton of efficiency to be had there. And with J.K. Dobbins, if you just look at his career, in games that he has 10 or more rush attempts, he absolutely balls out. 10 or more rush attempts is all it takes for J.K. Dobbins in his career, and he averages 15.8 points per game, which would be the RB10 this season. That is a 9-game sample of 10 or more carries. It's really not that crazy. So if he ever got into a role where you could pencil him in for 10 or more carries this year, I think like 12 plus, 13 plus points per game would be pretty plausible for Dobbins, which is fringe RB2 numbers. Now, after that, we have Tyrion Davis-Price, who we talked about on the waiver show, and he is just like Damian Harris, where the usage is so good on this 49ers offense. They love to use the running back. And when you have so many carries, so many targets going to running backs, and that's just a part of the offense. It's always been a part of the offense, even when it was Elijah Mitchell last year and they didn't have a McCaffrey. They never even had, this is the first time that Kyle Shanahan has had a real premier running back since I want to say like Devonta Freeman. Since then, he's been working with like Raheem Mostert's, Matt Breida's, Elijah Mitchell's, and with those guys, he's still one of the league leaders in usage to running back. So you have a spot here where you have some standalone value with Tyrion Davis-Price. Again, we talked about it in the waiver wire show. Week 1, Elijah Mitchell goes down. Jordan Mason is active over Ty Davis-Price, but only because of special teams, not because he's ahead of him on the depth chart. Next week, Ty Davis-Price has 14 carries to Jordan Mason's 0. Even though that Jordan Mason got 5 carries last week after Elijah Mitchell went down and Ty Davis-Price was inactive in that game, I still do believe that they see Ty Davis-Price as a better pure rusher. I believe he'll be active, which means that there is a standalone role there where he can sort of be the Elijah Mitchell guy, where once McCaffrey gets to his X amount of touches, Ty Davis-Price comes in, salts games away, gives you like 10-plus carries per game, even with McCaffrey in there. And McCaffrey, a guy who's been hurt the last few years, if he was to go down, you have the upside for a 2021 Elijah Mitchell type run with Ty Davis-Price. Again, that number at the top of the usage by team probably goes down a little bit, right? But it probably doesn't fall outside of like the top 5 to 10, and he'll be inheriting like 70% plus of that, 75% plus of that. And that's a really, really juicy role in a good offense. After that, we have our RB9 here, who is James Cook, who had a really slow start to the year. He was like behind Zach Moss, and then they trade for Nyheim Hines. And I'm going to be honest with you guys, I dropped him in a lot of places. I think a lot of people dropped him. It just seemed like there was no light at the end of the tunnel. He finally was beating out Zach Moss, and they traded for his replacement. But the crazy part is that they just haven't used his replacement, which is, I mean, I don't know. On the Bills side of things, it's a really weird move for them. But this is what it's been. Since week 9, James Cook has completely outsnapped Nyheim Hines in every single game. You look 5% to 18%, 15% to 25%, 8% to 17%. Just across the board, James Cook is seen by this team as the RB2. And when you have a spot like the Bills who are going to score a ton, going to be in a bunch of shootouts, second highest scoring offense in the NFL, that is a really, really valuable role to have on this team, especially James Cook was going to catch passes if he ever got shoved into that prominent role. So I have him as RB9 here, 26.1% owned in ESPN. He is pretty readily available out there. A guy who's probably free in your leagues that I really like is Dontrell Hilliard, man. Dontrell Hilliard has been so efficient on so few touches. He leads the NFL right now with players with like over 20 carries. So it's a small sample size, but he leads them with 6.8 yards per carry, which is crazy. He has his all-purpose skill set. He's explosive. He had a stretch last year before Deonta Foreman came in for the Titans where he had a couple games that were very usable in like that 12 to 18 point per game area. And he somehow at this point leads the Titans in receiving touchdowns with 4. He's explosive even in his limited touches. And if Derrick Henry was to go down and he could be the all-purpose guy, take catches out of the backfield, he would pretty easily, for me, be a top 30 back with upside where if we saw a week from him and he puts up, 15, 20 points, he is very easily into that RB2 conversation. You also have Derrick Henry, who I believe leads the league in like touches, carries, all of that kind of stuff. So he's another decent bet to eventually get hurt. Now, after that, we have our RB11, Khalil Herbert, who at this point is only at the fringe RB2s area because if the starter went down, he'd be an RB2, right? So it doesn't really accurately represent the label of this tier. But Khalil Herbert, the reason that he's not up there is because of injury. He is projected by Edwin Porras to return somewhere around week 15. This is week 15 plus, so it could be later than week 15. Maybe it's like week 16, week 17, which is tough, right? It's tough to have a guy on your bench who's kind of burning a hole there that might not ever actually step onto the field or do anything meaningful for you. So that's why I have him a little bit lower than consensus, or not than consensus, but a little bit lower than you would think based on what we're doing this ranking off of. But we saw week 3, David Montgomery got hurt and left the game, and then week 4, David Montgomery was not active. In those 2 weeks from week 3 to 4, he was the RB6 overall in scoring. Khalil Herbert's a legit talent. Montgomery goes down, he's very easily an RB2. Now, we have our last running back in this tier of fringe running back 2s if the starter was to go down, and that is going to be Kenny Gainwell. This was a prospect I really liked. He popped at Memphis. He literally alphaed, I believe that he alphaed both Antonio Gibson and Tony Pollard in the same year. I think that he outgained them from scrimmage. If not Tony Pollard, then at least Antonio Gibson. He was a uber producer at Memphis, really, really good pass catcher. And in the event that Miles Sanders was to ever go down here, he would be in a great spot. Boston Scott is going to take, some carries within the 20s, some goal line looks, some pass catching looks, but this would be Kenny Gainwell's backfield. He would see pretty much all of the receiving work. He would split between the tackles and goal line work with Boston Scott, but I think that's a fine role. That's essentially what Miles Sanders is behind the Eagles offensive line, which is PFF's #1 ranked offensive line in the NFL. They score the ball a ton. It would be a perfect spot for him off the rip. If Miles Sanders went down, he would be a top 30 running back for me that week. Now, this is where we venture into the disgusting parts of handcuffs, and this is for, deep leagues. If you're out there playing tournaments like FFPC, anything like that, these are going to be your guys. And our first one here, I just used the team logo because we're going to talk about 2 running backs. We're going to talk about the whole backfield here. JaMychal Hasty, Darrell Henderson. And the reason why I have them at the top of this tier is we got this quote from Doug Peterson that, as a guy who has ETN in a lot of places, scares the hell out of me. He said, Doug Peterson said he feels good about RB Travis Etienne's chances of playing Sunday versus the Lions. Peterson said Etienne will go through walkthrough portions of practice today, but they don't want to rush him to full go before he's 100%. He had a Liz Frank injury, which is a mid-foot injury. He now has a foot sprain. I don't know if it's the same foot, but it's a foot sprain. He was taken out of the game. Peterson keeps saying that he was fine. He could have played. In my opinion, you're playing the Ravens. Everything's on the line. They're doing everything they can to try and win that game. I think if they had access to ETN, they probably would have played him. I have a tough time buying that he was cleared to go back in that game. I have a tough time buying that he's going to be 100% ready to go for Sunday. This puts the status up in the air, which means Michael Hasty and Darrell Henderson are very interesting right now. And I would put Michael Hasty ahead of Darrell Henderson here because we just saw him drop 20 when ETN left last week's game. He had 20 PPR points, looked explosive, looked amazing against the Ravens. He also has, not seniority, but he's been there longer than Darrell Henderson, which this will be Darrell Henderson's first game active for the Jaguars this weekend. So I'm not really expecting him to take anything in the short term. I think Michael Hasty is a short-term play, but I think long-term, Darrell Henderson will have the opportunity to sort of eat into that and, become the number 2 back on the depth chart ahead of JaMychal Hasty by year's end. But again, if ETN doesn't see time, then JaMychal Hasty is probably the guy you want to roster in the near term. Now, after that, our RB14 here is going to be Zamir White. And this is a guy who I kind of liked during draft season. He hasn't really seen the field at all. He didn't produce, but he played in the SEC. He played at Georgia. He is 6 foot, 214 pounds, runs a 4.4 flat. He is a athletic freak, but I know a lot of film guys say that when he's on the field, he doesn't show that athleticism, kind of a Mike Gesicki corollary here. But you have a spot where Josh Jacobs is apparently dealing with a calf injury. He's not going to practice this week, but they're going to try and get him to go for Sunday, which means that his status is up in the air. And with Zamir White, you have Amir Abdul in the backfield. You have, I think, Brandon Bolden as well. Neither of those guys are threats between the tackles. Of course, they're going to steal all of the pass-catching work away from Zamir White, but he's going to walk into a running back room that has 19.6 carries per game allocated to Josh Jacobs. To me, it wouldn't be crazy to see him pick up like 12 to 15 in that first week. This offense has been moving the ball as of lately. He's athletic. He'd probably be the preferred goal line back there. So for me, I think RB3 is maybe even being a little bit conservative with a Zamir White. Then we have the Jets backfield, which again will just be showed with a logo. And the reason that these guys aren't higher, I probably would have had them here. But we had, similar to Najee Harris, Michael Carter goes from having a high ankle sprain, potentially out the next 3, 4, 5 weeks, to having a low ankle sprain and potentially missing just the next week or so. So this is a team that likes to run the ball. And I have James Robinson and Zonovan Knight here as long-term handcuffs, but I think you also have immediate upside because if Michael Carter can't go, which it seems like he won't, you can start one of them this week. My preferred option is Zonovan Knight. He was a featured part of this offense. He had 5 touches to 8 Michael Carter touches before Michael Carter even got hurt. He was pretty much a part of this game plan going into this game. They activated him. They healthy scratched James Robinson. They were using Zonovan Knight right out of the gate. So I think that he is going to get the first crack at this lead job. And if he plays well this Sunday, he is going to pretty much lock up that role ahead of James Robinson. If he doesn't, James Robinson probably has the opportunity to also win that back. So I think both are good stashes just in case if Michael Carter re-injures anything. There's points to go around in this backfield. There's some uncertainty right now with that Carter injury. So I don't mind it. You also have the Mike White effect, who, targeted Michael Carter like 10 times a game last season. So that also makes this backfield valuable. After that, we have RB16. And I put Tyler Algier here because the big issue with this Falcons offense or Falcons backfield has been, it's been a three-way committee. You've had, or like even like four-way sometimes. You've had like Avery Williams in there. You've had Caleb Huntley on top of Tyler Algier, on top of Cordarrelle Patterson. You even had like whispers of like Damian Williams coming back. But now, as of last week, things are starting to condense ever so slightly, where among 23 running back carries, 22 of them went to Cordarrelle Patterson and Tyler Algier, and of 6 running back targets, 5 of them went to Cordarrelle Patterson and Tyler Algier. So that's only 2 running back touches that didn't go to CPAT or Algier out of like 29. So that's really nice. Things are condensing. You also have the upside of a standalone role for Tyler Algier if the absence of Kyle Pitts means that Cordarrelle Patterson's going to line up more on the outside, run more routes, get more targets, and you have a spot here where Tyler Algier can carve out a nice little role here. And if Cordarrelle Patterson gets hurt again this year, you have Tyler Algier. Now, instead of splitting the backfield 3 ways, he is the preferred option, the lead guy, and probably like a 65% snap share. The rest sort of divvied up between Avery Williams and Caleb Huntley. And in an offense that runs this much, that's a valuable role. The rest of these are just like pretty pure ugly handcuffs, though. We have Matt Breida here, RB17. Saquon Barkley is having the most touches in a season that he's had since before the ACL injury, which is a little bit scary. The only other running back on this team is Gary Brightwell, who is like kind of a like in-between fullback. And this is a run-oriented team. I think Matt Breida would pretty easily see like 15-plus touches per game on a run-oriented offense. And you have Keontae Ingram, who you guys know, I absolutely loved him coming out of school. Good recruit, produced early at Texas, and then Bijan Robinson came in, completely stole his lunch money. He transfers to USC, plays well, all-purpose guy, good size, can run the ball, can catch the ball. So I like his skill set, and I think that they sort of told us that they like Keontae Ingram. This was a guy this is a team that, Benjamin, his first year was a redshirt year. He never even touched the field. Keontae Ingram, in his first year, he looked good. I want to say it was the Cardinals-Saints game on Thursday night. He looked good in that game. And then they go out and cut, Benjamin. So that was before Darrell Williams was good to go. And it just tells us that they like Keontae Ingram. They think that he's a fine backup to James Conner. And with Darrell Williams at this point not really being much of a factor on this team, I think if James Conner was to go down, Keontae Ingram would immediately slide in there and be, somewhere in that RB 32 to 35 range. And you could sort of go from there in that next week if he played well. I think you could even argue that he should belong in Fringe RB2 area. Same with Zamir White. Same with a lot of these guys. But after that, we have Josh Kelly. And immediately after returning from IR, he passes Isaiah Spiller on the depth chart. This is a team that uses their running back a lot. I know it's Austin Eckler, so it's skewed a little bit, that chart that we showed earlier. Let me pull it right back up real quick. But I believe that they were number 2 in the running back usage by team. Or no, they were number 4. So they're up there. Of course, Eckler goes down and they probably, get bumped down to like below Dallas. But that's still like a top 15 team in expected points per game. It'd be a little bit of a committee with Sony Michel and Isaiah Spiller. But I think they like Kelly enough for him to see 65% plus of that workload and be, a serviceable RB3 on 0 RB teams if that was the case. They run a ton of plays. They run the ball. They pass the ball. There's a ton there to like. And you also have Deion Jackson here. This is our last running back, RB20 in our handcuff rankings here. And we've seen one good game with him without JT in the mix where he went crazy for like 12 targets. I think he was the RB1 overall in the entire week. And he's now in a spot where he has Matt Ryan at quarterback, which means there's going to be a ton of checkdowns available. So if JT was to go down, there's not really many running backs behind him. I think there's Zach Moss there. Deion Jackson would likely be the lead guy and probably be peppered with targets from Matt Ryan and be a nice top 36 option in that given week, maybe even higher than that. Now, moving on here, feel free to, I don't know if you want to like screenshot this or whatever, but I think this would be good where today, if you go through your teams and you're just sort of like, all right, so I have this bum wide receiver on my team. Who should I drop him for? Are these running backs on my waivers? Boom. There you have it. Now, moving on. I honestly should have made this 2 videos, man. We're at 30 minutes. we'll squeeze it into one. I'm not doing I think a separate quarterback streamer, defense streamer video you guys wouldn't even care about, but we'll kind of, we'll sort of do a little bit rapid fire, but you guys know me. That's always a struggle, but we'll talk about quarterbacks here. And with quarterbacks, we have a couple of different, what I would call categories. And we have QB streamers and we have QB stashes. And streamers to me are guys who can be played in favorable matchups as low-end plays that are readily available on waivers, that can't really keep up with those top guys. And stashes for me are guys that I'm looking for, right? I have a team right now that's really, really hot. It's literally top 15 in NFC's tournament right now. It's doing really, really well. My quarterback's Geno Smith. And Geno Smith has been great, right? He's like a top 8 quarterback. He's amazing. But there is something in the back of my head that's like, man, like what happens when this runs out? Let's say week 16 rolls around and Geno Smith sucks. Like, it could go south, okay? He could go south. Hopefully, the magic encapsulates itself. But I've been through this as a Jets fan. I've seen it with Ryan Fitzpatrick. He goes to the Bucs. He gets pulled for Jameis Winston. Things like this happen. I'm not saying the magic is going to run out, but it's on my mind what happens in that scenario. Because when you're in a league like that with 20-man rosters, you are staring at Kenny Pickett, Jacoby Brissett, who's not even usable anymore, Matt Ryan. The quarterback waivers are really thin. And I know that a lot of you guys out there might even be in more casual leagues where everyone is holding like 2 to 3 quarterbacks for no reason, and quarterback waivers get thin that way. And I think that if you are someone who, maybe you're just streaming guys, maybe you have like Trevor Lawrence, you're streaming him, or you're streaming matchup to matchup, you need to think for the playoffs, what, just long shot dart can I throw that by the time playoffs come around, maybe I have a quarterback that can go toe-to-toe with those guys, especially if you missed out on a Deshaun Watson. Go to toe-to-toe with those Burrow, those Josh Allen, those Hurts, those Lamar teams. And these are players I think are long shots to even get there, but guys that I'm thinking about adding in some places. Now, the way that I broke this down is I made a little chart. Again, you guys know me. Made a nice little chart here where the top end has streamers, the bottom side has upside stashes, I'm calling them, and you have the quarterback name. Rostership is how many teams or what percentage of teams they're on ESPN. And then I have their playoff schedule. So week 15 opponent, their adjusted fantasy points allowed from JJ Zacharyason's data dump. He does that, I want to say, every Monday on his Patreon. Really, really good stuff if you're like into the stats and putting it into Excel and kind of looking at stuff like me. Playoff matchups, and then their rank and adjusted fantasy points allowed. So we can kind of see what these playoff schedules look like, get a feel for what we're sort of setting ourselves up for in the fantasy playoffs. And with the streamers, we have 2 guys here. We have Daniel Jones, who admittedly is a little bit more of a luxury guy. 62.5% owned means he's likely not on waivers in your league. But if he is, I just want to put it out there. He sits at quarterback 12 on the year. He's a solid schedule down the stretch. He has 2 middle-of-the-road defenses in Washington and Indianapolis. And he has a nice top 10 matchup, which, by the way, these numbers, it's 10th scoring. So Minnesota gives up the 10th most fantasy points. Washington gives up the 16th most fantasy points. Indianapolis gives up the 15th most fantasy points. So the higher the number is red, lower the number is green. You want to have low numbers. And it's not a beautiful schedule, right, Daniel Jones? But again, he's been the QB 12. He's been getting there on rushing. And these are, I would call like neutral matchups to fine matchups. After that, we have Jimmy Garoppolo, who in my eyes has a better schedule here. He's the lower end play. He's like the QB 17 in points per game this year, but he has a better schedule. He gets the 11th most fantasy points allowed defense in Seattle. He gets the 2nd most allowed fantasy points defense in Las Vegas. 16 is a little bit tough against Washington, like for Daniel Jones, but again, 16th just means it's middle of the road. He should be fine. Jimmy G gets a lot of his production from his receivers and their yak abilities with CMC, Kittle, Ayuk, Debo. And I think you can actually, if you're out there, maybe you have Daniel Jones and like Jimmy G's floating around on your waiver wire, maybe pick up Jimmy G and maybe go back and forth with these guys. If you thread the needle here, you can play the 11th most allowed points per game defense in Seattle, and then you can start Daniel Jones in week 16, who plays Minnesota, who's allowing the 10th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, and then Jimmy G again in week 17 versus Las Vegas, who's allowing the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. So maybe that can kind of, go out there, compete with your Jalen Hurts, Mahomes teams. Now, again, I know you guys are probably eyeing up. I probably should have hid them below. You guys are probably eyeing up these stashes like, Ron, what the hell are you cooking down there? And I'm telling you guys, waivers are thin out there. I personally have a team where I scooped up Jameis Winston. These are guys, they're not really particularly in any order. It's really just gut feel how you feel about these guys. I'm just looking what guys have that 1 in a million shot, that 1 in 100 shot at, seizing a starting role, playing well, having a light schedule. Now, Jameis Winston here, we'll talk through them just the order I have them on the screen. Jameis Winston does not have a great schedule down the stretch, right? We have 5th most points allowed in Atlanta, which is a great matchup for him at home in a dome. Cleveland and Philadelphia, a little bit tougher, where it's 22nd most and 32nd most adjusted fantasy points to quarterbacks. But what I will say about Jameis is Andy Dalton has been uninspiring. They get a bye week in week 14. I believe the reason that Jameis Winston hasn't been playing as of lately is because of injury. He had that weird, everything's broken in his back, in week 2 and 3. He's taken some time. Maybe over the bye week, they get him healthy. They install some kind of game plan. I'm just saying, this is all a wish. Maybe you come out of the week 14 bye. None of this happens. Andy Dalton's a starter. Boom, you cut Jameis Winston, whatever. But if you're struggling at quarterback and you need some upside, I think it's there with Jameis Winston. He had 34 attempts, 40 attempts, 41 attempts in his only 3 games this year. He's going to see the volume. He is likely going to see a shootout with Atlanta. He could see a shootout with Cleveland, especially in Cleveland. The Philly one is a little bit tough. Maybe that's when you go out there, pick up your Jimmy G, and kind of thread the needle that way. It's really going to be about probably, if you don't have an elite quarterback, right? If you don't have Burrow and above, you're probably going to have to get 2 quarterbacks on your team that you can sort of alternate between for the fantasy playoffs. So I think Jameis Winston's an okay option. Again, the schedule isn't great, but the upside is there. He throws the ball a ton. They play in domes, shootouts, all of that good stuff. Now, the next one, it's going to be a tough sell. I know it's going to be a tough sell, but Jordan Love, okay? And he's available everywhere. So 0.9% of leagues is where he's owned. So that means he's available in pretty much everywhere. If you're in a shallow league, don't go out there, pick up Jordan Love. Again, this is if you're scraping the bottom of the barrel every week on waivers and there's nothing really around. I don't hate Jordan Love. He didn't play too bad. Now, it was 9 pass plays that he had here. Let me blow this up a little bit bigger. It was 9 pass plays that he had, but he did lead the NFL last week in EPA and CPOE composite, which is expected points added, which is just how much are you giving on a per play basis over expectation of what your offense is expected to get. So if you have a drive on the 50, I think that your expected points is 2.5. So if you get a field goal, your EPA, your expected points added there is 0.5, right? So 0.5 above what you were expected. On a per play basis, he was balling out. Completion over expected is just based on your ADOT, what should your completion percentage be? He was out shooting that as well. So he looked really good across the board. Again, just 9 pass plays, one of them being that big touchdown from Watson. So it's all a little bit skewed, but he played well late in this game. And you have a spot here where the Packers have Aaron Rodgers. The Packers are also doing awful. I think that they're 4-7 at this point, 4-8 at this point. They are almost at the spot where they are officially out of playoffs. And once they become mathematically eliminated from the playoffs, there is a pretty good chance for Aaron Rodgers to not play the rest of the season. Say, hey, I'm not going to risk my health. He's dealing with all kinds of injuries out here. Boom, Jordan Love time. And that would be really, really good for fantasy. He has a cannon of an arm. He also is a guy that's pretty mobile. In my prospect model, the RS grading system, I know a lot of you redraft guys probably aren't familiar with it, but I have a prospect model that groups quarterbacks into archetypes: statue, mobile, Konami code. He falls into mobile, which is nice. Mobile are guys like Kenny Pickett, who's been doing a ton on the ground this year. Trevor Lawrence, who's been doing a ton on the ground this year. Joe Burrow. Mitch Trubisky as well, who's just an example of a bad quarterback that gives you rushing upside when he plays. So he's somewhere on that spectrum. We still haven't really seen what Jordan Love looks like. Maybe he goes out there and balls. He has a pretty nice schedule too, where you can let him play. Oh, spoiled that for you guys. But you can let him play in Week 15 against the Rams. You don't play him in that matchup. And then against Miami, he gets the defense at allowing the 3rd most adjusted fantasy points to quarterbacks in Week 16. And then in Minnesota, he gets the 10th most points allowed defense in Minnesota as a home game versus Minnesota. So he has some light up matchups here. Again, home run swing on a guy like Jordan Love, but there is upside there for something good to happen. Again, shot in the dark. Maybe he goes out there against the Rams, he lays an egg, and it's there's no way I can start this guy. Again, these are Hail Mary type stashes at quarterback, but again, I'm trying to get creative here. I'm trying to search the waivers for something that can compete with those top end quarterbacks. Now, our last one here is admittedly rough, Russell Wilson. And we have no clue if Russell Wilson ever becomes the Russell Wilson that we know and love, vintage Russell Wilson by the end of the year, but maybe I know he's been taking losses. He got yelled at on the sideline. I think some people didn't show up to his birthday party, which is actually really sad if you're asking me. Maybe he gets it back. All right, maybe he gets it going. He has weapons, right? He has Dulcich. He has Sutton. He has Judy. Maybe he reignites something. Maybe he figures something out. He has a schedule down the stretch to be really good. So he's in a spot where he is available in over half of ESPN leagues. It doesn't hurt at all to just sneak him onto your bench. It's Russell Wilson. Again, he could be awful. He could stink. But if he turns things around in time for playoffs and you get a prime Russell Wilson putting up 20 points per game, playing against Arizona at home, who is allowing the fourth most adjusted fantasy points to quarterbacks, Week 16, not so great. That's when you would want to sub in your Daniel Jones or your Jimmy Garoppolo, whatever. And then Week 17 versus Kansas City Chiefs. Again, if this is the Russell Wilson that turns the corner and looks good, then we have a shootout versus KC, who is allowing the sixth most adjusted fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. Again, all a stretch with these quarterback stashes, but you got to get creative when we're trying to match pretty much what I would call the quarterback meta right now in fantasy. Now, our last thing we're going to touch on here, I'm not a defense guy. I literally tell you guys in live streams, don't ask me defense questions. I'm really not that great here. I just put together pretty much rankings and sort of figured out who has the most favorable schedules down the stretch that aren't owned everywhere. And the Chiefs, by far, have the best playoff defense. You get to destroy Houston on the road in Houston in Week 15, who is allowing the second most adjusted fantasy points to defenses right now. You then have Seattle, who is going to be fine, but it'll be Seattle in KC, which is a really tough place to play. They're loud. They have the tomahawk chant. Chiefs lay it on you. They put you in a really tough spot, the Chiefs, because if they get up early and Mahomes gets up early and you're down 14 and you're now in drop back every play mode, Chris Jones is going to get after you. They're going to force you to make a mistake, force a fumble, throw a pick downfield, trying to play catch up. Quietly, the Chiefs defense is actually pretty good for fantasy. And you also have Denver at the end here, where if you completely disagree with my Russell Wilson thing from before, and you believe Russell Wilson will be this Russell Wilson we've seen all year through the end of the year, then boom, you pick up the Chiefs, you play him against Russell Wilson in Week 17, and you win your league. After that, we're taking a huge jump below. But you have the Vikings here, who are 11th in points per game among defenses, which is fine. They get a game versus Tennessee, they get a game versus Indianapolis in Week 15, who's allowing the most adjusted fantasy points per game to opposing defenses, which is a really good matchup. And then he gets the Giants, and then he gets Green Bay. Two matchups that aren't great. Green Bay is about neutral, 16th most adjusted fantasy points to opposing defenses. The Giants 21st, but the Giants one is at home, and potentially the Green Bay one is against Jordan Love, where if you thought that I was crazy again for recommending Jordan Love, then you play the Vikings defense against Jordan Love and you profit. Now the last one, here is the toughest one because they have a beautiful, beautiful schedule, the Chargers, but they are the third lowest point per game defense right now, which is really, really bad. Maybe their defense gets healthier. I know Joey Bosa's out. I know J.C. Jackson's out. I'm not sure if and when those guys can even return. This is if you're really struggling. I'm not really even recommending that you burn a roster spot on these guys, but just someone to have on your radar, once playoffs happen. I know in some leagues I'm in, waivers lock once the playoffs start. So if you want to sort of, grab a secondary defense, I think the Chargers are okay. They're playing against Tennessee in Week 15, which isn't great. They're allowing just the 14th most fantasy points to opposing defenses, which is about neutral. But then you get Indianapolis, who's allowing the first most, and the Rams, who are allowing the third most. Those are two really, really good matchups. Indianapolis, we don't really know what to expect from them. It'll probably be Matt Ryan. And then the Rams, who knows if it's going to be Bryce Perkins? Who knows if it's going to be a banged-up Stafford? Probably won't be a banged-up Stafford. Could be a Walford. So that's a good matchup, especially that's going to be it'll be at home for both LA teams. But they're a team that's not owned anywhere, has a great playoff schedule. The issue is that the defense themselves isn't that great. Now, that is going to do it for us today. I hope you guys enjoyed that. I wanted that to be much, much shorter. I wanted that to be like 30 minutes. We went pretty much 45 here. This is a different type of video that I haven't done on this channel yet, but it seemed like it'd be a fun idea to kind of go through and strategize what we should be doing to get our teams ready for the playoffs. Something I'm actually about to do. Once I post this video, which it's getting a little bit late, 6:35 p.m. here, I'm going to have to submit waivers for all my high stakes teams, which don't let you submit waivers in the playoffs, which is a pretty crazy rule. So when that happens, I believe that'll be next week's waiver wire run. I need to make sure all my playoff teams are ready to roll. So I'll actually be using these handcuff rankings myself. So with all that being said, hope you all enjoyed. Don't really have anything to plug. I think I don't want to tease you guys. I think I might stream a Dynasty mock draft tomorrow. We shall see. We'll get a Players You Must Start on Friday. We'll do a underdog stream on Saturday. I would also like to get a Dynasty Rankings update out for the Patreon because I do it every 4 weeks. So after week 4, after week 8, and then naturally this would be after week 12. So I have a lot to get through this weekend. Expect next week uploads to be back to normal. We'll probably be doing like 5 to 6 plus a live stream pretty much through Christmas and then probably take another little break. But I'm rambling here. As always, if you enjoyed, make sure you go down below, subscribe, leave a like. It helps the boy out a ton. And I will see y'all in the next one.
I got the juice, I got the juice.
10-0, Chatham's on. Foolies glad I'm home. Even my haters kinda glad I'm on. Rest in peace to my vagabond. Rapper, song, singer, suspended, subpoena for misdemeanors.